Now, to give you some more insight into what we mean by this relationship between value, quantity demanded, price, let's consider a particular market. Let's consider the market for coffee. Now, the market for coffee is one of these markets where people are willing to pay a lot of different prices for a cup of coffee. Let's take our first consumer. We'll just call them Consumer 1. Consumer 1's value for a cup of coffee is $5. So, let's see how this relates to the demand curve. Consumer 1, we could draw a demand curve for Consumer 1 by considering how many cups of coffee Consumer 1 would be willing to buy at various prices. So we could do a little schedule here of price and quantity demanded, and we could ask Consumer 1, so how much would you be willing to buy at various prices? So I'm just going to keep things simple and keep my price of a cup of coffee in whole numbers. So if the price of a cup of coffee were $6 and you ask Consumer 1 if they'd be willing to buy it, Consumer 1 would say, no thank you. Consumer 1 is not going to pay $6 for something that's only worth $5 to him or her. Now, to understand what this consumer might do if they were offered a cup of coffee for $5 and the value that they put on a cup of coffee is $5, let's introduce a concept known as consumer surplus. Consumer surplus, what love to abbreviate in this class, so we'll probably often just refer to it as CS. Consumer surplus is the gain that a consumer gets from making an exchange. In this case, the exchange being consumer trades in their money for a cup of coffee. And by definition, the consumer surplus is equal to the difference between the value that the consumer receives less the price that the consumer pays. Now, so again, consumer surplus is equal to the value that the consumer receives less the price that the consumer pays. So for our consumer in this example, if she buys a cup of coffee for $5, her consumer surplus would be equal to the $5 value she receives from that cup of coffee less the price that she pays. So her consumer surplus would actually just be 0. Okay, again, she receives a $5 value, that's what the coffee's worth to her, but she paid $5 to get it, so her consumer surplus is 0. If she doesn't buy, then we can also calculate her consumer surplus. In this case, well, if she doesn't buy a cup of coffee, she doesn't get any value from a cup of coffee, and she paid nothing for the cup of coffee, so her consumer surplus is also 0. Technically, the opportunity cost of these two alternatives is the same, and so she is indifferent between whether she'd want to buy a cup of coffee or not. In the event that a consumer is indifferent, we're going to assume that she would go ahead and buy. Okay, and it's pretty obvious as the price falls, as long as the price does not exceed the consumer's value, she'd be willing and able to buy the cup of coffee. Now, so if the price was $4, we know she'd be willing to buy at least 1 cup of coffee. Price falls to 3, at least 1, and so on. Now, of course, in reality, she might want to have more than 1 cup of coffee per day, but that's something we'll explore further later on. But the idea here is that we have this relationship between the consumer's value and how, given a price in that consumer's value, the quantity of coffee she would demand. Here we have all the information needed to draw this one consumer's demand curve. Of course, when we talk about a market demand curve, you're literally talking about taking all the consumers in the market and figuring out how many cups of coffee they are willing to buy at different prices.